is not as responsive, so I'll just mention that. Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to this consultation which we are hosting. First of all, let me just make sure everyone can hear me on the phone. So we'll do a quick check, a quick intro of who's online on the phone. And then we have people on the Google Hangout as well, and we have participants here in person too. So we'll do a quick intro individually. All right, so I'm Salim Ali. I'm a professor here at the University of Queensland, and it's a pleasure for me to be co-hosting this event at the Sustainable Minerals Institute. Sharon Flem's with me here, who will be facilitating as well and is one of the co-authors of the report. Sharon, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. You just introduced me. Sharon Flynn.
No, more to you than that.
And yes, so I worked with the World Economic Forum, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment in UNDP to help map these goals. And we should have online there Brandon Lewis, who's the lead author. Brandon, are you there? Can you hear us?
I can hear you well, Sharon and Salim, thanks. As Sharon just mentioned, I've been working with her on this great project. Was conducting some of the major interviews over the past summer, and yeah, glad to be online with you tonight.
Thank you, Brandon, especially since you're in New York and it's wee hours of the morning here, so thanks for joining. All right, before we go around the room, let's try to make sure we have people on the phone introducing themselves. Others online, please, if you can go ahead.
Yeah, hello, it's Colin Tingle online. I'm the Corporate Social Responsibility Manager at Cameco Corporation in Perth, West Australia.
Great, thank you. Anyone else on the phone?
Hi, it's got Melinda McLeod. I'm from BHP Billiton.
Great, thank you, Melinda. And which part of BHP are you working in?
In the Senior Manager Environment in the group office.
Okay, fantastic. Okay.
Hi, Chris Vernon from MSCI ESG Research in Sydney.
Welcome. Thank you. Anyone else on the phone?
This Harris, with Queensland University of Technology Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Studies.
Okay, great. Welcome. Next, anyone else on the phone? Okay, we also have some viewers on the Google Hangout, but they are not able to connect by audio. If they would like to send questions to the chat room, or if they want to email us, you can email questions by sending a message to csrm@uq.edu.au. csrm@uq.edu.au. Thank you so much. Okay, now we go around the room as well to have introductions. My colleague here.
Hi everyone, Deanna Kemp is my name. I'm a program leader of the Extractives and Communities area at CSRM here at SMI.
Great.
My name is Rebecca Ramsey. I'm a PhD student at CSRM.
Okay.
Barry Nolan, I'm Principal Research Fellow in the Centre for Mineland Rehabilitation at SMI UQ, and I'm a contaminant expert.
I'm Madeline Birdie. I'm a group advisor for human rights and policy at Rio Tinto.
Kieran Beach, the communities team at Rio Tinto.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. So we will get started then with the PowerPoints. Those of you who are on the phone, you can certainly view the PowerPoint through the Google Hangout. It should be live and showing up there. So I'll start off with the opening slide just to give you a background. Our involvement with this effort spans a few different interests. We've collaborated closely with the Columbia Center on sustainable investments on a range of projects, and it's a pleasure to connect with them on this as well. My chair at University of Queensland focuses on how to help with research capacity in reaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and UQ is a formal member of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is also a co-sponsor of this exercise. And then the World Economic Forum, we've had a very close relationship with on various matters as well. And I've worked with them over the past 4 years, part of the Young Global Leaders program. And so we are very thrilled to be involved in these different capacities. UNDP is also part of this process as one of the stewarding organizations within the UN for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've done several projects for UNDP also. All right, so the first slide, after the intro slide, if we move forward, and there's a little bit of a lag time in terms of the slides showing up on the Google Hangout, but just bear with that. In terms of those of you who are on the telephone, you may see the slides a little later. So in any event, okay, yeah, just on the side, Michelle, if you can just scroll down, just, yeah, just the first slide, just once, just click once, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Just click once on it and it'll go down, or just page down, just press page down. Yeah, okay. So just to give you some background on the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN goes through these exercises periodically to set targets, and the most significant one in the last 20 years or so was the Millennium Development Goals that many of you must have heard of. And that was launched before the millennium, the turn of the millennium, and there were a series of goals that were set, primarily 8 goals, and they were quite broad. And the target date for meeting those goals was 2015. And so when 2015 was approaching, the UN recognized that there needed to be a next phase of these goal-setting processes. And so the Sustainable Development Goals Initiative was launched to first see how much progress had been made on the Millennium Development Goals, and then to use that progress as a way of then charting for the next 15 to 20 years the trajectory for the meeting of these new targets. The Sustainable Development Goals are far more detailed than the Millennium Development Goals, and they were launched in September 2015. We'll go through them in a moment on the next slide. But just to give you a primer, they are aimed at trying to unpack a lot of the earlier goals that were put forward in the Millennium process. For example, in the Millennium process, environment was just one goal, whereas here they have unpacked environment into a series of goals, including climate action, clean water and sanitation, and so on and so forth as well. So this SDGs, as they are now being called, are much more focused on measurable metrics, and in terms of the targets themselves, there are over 100 different targets, and so there's much more level of granularity in the analysis. Now, I should note that there's been quite a bit of cynicism about that. In some of the public discourse, there are people, and there are sometimes editorials being written about this, that this is somewhat unattainable and how are they going to move forward. But it's very important to note that, as with, if you could please mute your phone if you're on the line, because we're getting feedback. So thank you. So in terms of the cynicism around these goals, it's really important to note that a lot of times this comes from a general concern about these macro level processes at the UN. We recognize that this can be an inefficient system, but the reality is that the UN is the closest we have to some kind of global governance mechanism, and inefficient as it may be, it still provides us an opportunity to have those conversations and to set some consensus targets. So that's how we are approaching this, in that spirit that we have to work with the system. When you have nation states who have their own peculiar, national interests, the only way forward is this kind of laborious process of consensus building. And so I hope that all of you will approach it in that same sense of pragmatism, because we just don't have any other process of engaging everyone together. So that being said, the UN has tried to be very inclusive, and this effort is specifically trying to focus on getting the mining industry involved and seeing how we can target these goals for the industry. And so Sharon's going to now go through, or Brandon's going to go through specifically some of the ways in which the industry was engaged in this exercise through the World Economic Forum. So Brandon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Salim. So as Salim just said, we'll switch now from kind of the SDGs in general to mining and SDGs in particular. A lot of great work has been done in the mining and sustainable development space over the past 15 years. Mining, minerals, and sustainable development. There's been many others as well. But as Salim mentioned, the SDGs are a truly global framework with all 190-some countries on board. The goal of this project is to kind of locate mining within this global framework. We have the four organizations we've already talked about: the World Economic Forum, UNDP, CCSI, and SDSN, and kind of got together and asked how can we locate mining within the SDGs. And the first order of business was talking to experts. So, including some of you, we talked to people across the stakeholder spectrum, industry, civil society, governments, multilateral institutions, kind of across the board. And that all happened from June to August last year. September, we held a special panel and high-level working session coinciding with the UN General Assembly in New York. And there we presented an executive summary on some of the kind of the results of the interviews and some preliminary findings. We got some great feedback then, and then over the course of the next few months, we incorporated that feedback into the draft of the full report that is on the website where you found the link for this Google Hangout. So we just published a consultative draft in January, and then we have kind of an open comment period until April. So we're looking forward to getting some great feedback from you today. And then we hope to publish the report in June, after which we'll focus on implementation. So next slide, please.
Yep. Is it coming up now on the?
It's a delay.
Yeah, Brandon, are you seeing the next slide?
Yeah,
Okay.
Got it now. Great, perfect. So the logic of this project is basically, it's fairly simple. It's that mining can contribute both positively and negatively to sustainable development. So the question is, how do we increase the positive contributions to SDGs and decrease the negative contributions? And there are some factors about mining that make it unique in its ability to make these positive contributions. For example, scale. Mining is capable of mobilizing huge resources on a vast scale for achievement of SDGs. It also is a catalyst for investment, technology, knowledge transfer, innovation, developing upward, downward stream linkages, as well as connecting areas with infrastructure, perhaps that didn't have it before. Mining can be a source of multiplier in the labor market, creating jobs directly and indirectly. And then its scope. I mean, mining happens everywhere, including in remote and less developed areas. So these factors about mining kind of really make it able to contribute a great deal, but also make the state hot. But we know historically, although we're seeing a lot of progress recently, mining has been the source of some negative impacts as well. So we want to look at how to minimize those impacts. So we'll go to the next slide. The next slide up on your end?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, great. So the purpose of this project, we're calling the Atlas, is to help the mining industry kind of navigate across the value chain, across, from exploration through to production and closure, how it can contribute to the SDGs. So one kind of mainstream the SDGs, translated out of kind of the UN language into language that makes sense in the mining industry for companies, kind of set off some brainstorming and creative thinking about how the SDGs can be incorporated into the core business of mining, and how mining can partner with other development actors as well. So we have three main outcomes that we are hoping to facilitate. The first is basically just what are the SDGs? So we want to increase understanding about what the SDGs are. The second is raising awareness about some of the major challenges and opportunities that SDGs pose for mining. And the third is to get people talking, to facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue and collaboration towards achievement of SDGs. So go to the next slide.
Okay, it's up.
Great. So each chapter of, so there are 17 chapters in the Atlas, one for each SDG. In each chapter, we talk about how mining can incorporate the SDGs into its core business, how it can collaborate with other stakeholders in partnership, and leverage additional resources to address each SDG. And then have some practical examples of ways that mining companies have done these already or are currently doing them. That's kind of the overview of how the Atlas is structured. Go to the next slide.
Okay, it's
And
up.
I'll assume this up. So some of the key findings are that mining impacts all 17 SDGs. So we'll talk more about some of the major SDGs that mining impacts most. At first glance, it kind of seems like maybe mining might not directly relate to something like ending hunger. But really, one of the main findings is that mining does kind of overlap with all 17 of these. In this, it's important to recognize that all stakeholders have different roles. So mining is not responsible for everything. We'll come back to this briefly in a second. So number two, despite mining being relevant for all 17, there are some roles where mining does have the capacity to move the needle a bit more. You see these listed here. We can talk more specifics later if you want. And the third is that the impacts are not all one directional. So, mining can make positive and negative contributions. It can impact things directly and indirectly. Go to the next slide. So this diagram basically shows that mining can link to or can do something about all 17 goals. So you kind of see, the inner circle has the icons for the SDGs, and the outer circle is basically full of issue areas. So you can see there's a number of them for each SDG. As an example, I mentioned mining and ending hunger, which is SDG 2 earlier. At first glance, they're not necessarily linked. However, for example, fertilizer is a major component is potash. Fertilizers increase crop yield, or can do so. On the flip side, competition for land between mining and agriculture might increase the difficulty of making enough food. So there can be positive and negative impacts on food security. That's just an example. Sharon will share some more in a minute. And then the next slide. So as I mentioned, the SDGs are ambitious, they're global, they're a massive undertaking, but they involve everybody. So this is not all on the mining industry. The mining industry is definitely not responsible for everything, but it is responsible for part of it. And in that process, it will collaborate with government, with civil society, with multilateral organizations, and they each have their own kind of major areas of focus. So that's something we try to bring out from the report. We won't go into it in great detail here, but it's important to recognize in the partnership context that there are different roles and responsibilities. So now I will hand it over to Sharon.
Hi, great. Thanks, Brandon. Just so people know, I'm just going to talk a bit about, give a couple of examples of what we've done in a couple of chapters. We assume that everyone's sort of taken a look. We're not going to go through all 17 chapters. And then we've got some key questions in the end, and we want to open it up for discussion. If you want, we can delve into the SDGs depending on what it is you all want to talk about, but we want to wrap up the presentation fairly quickly. So we really tried in writing these chapters, note that for each of the SDGs and for all 169 targets, Brandon led a very detailed process in which I think we ended up, Brandon, with 79 targets. How many did we refer to in the atlas?
Yeah, that number sounds about right here.
Yeah, 79. So each of the chapters lays out the SDG goal and then the targets that are underneath that goal that we thought were relative to the mining industry. We didn't include all 169 targets. We just Brandon can explain to you if you have questions about that, about the methodology that was used. We then thought that it was really important to lay out two types of contributions. The first is fundamentally what mining can do through the business of mining. And then the second was what mining can do in collaboration with others to leverage resources. Understand this is an atlas whose audience is the entire mining industry. So there are going to be some of the large majors like the Rio Tintos or the Chemicos or the BHPs that have a lot of resources and staff to be able to think through these things. And then there may be some smaller mining companies that are just focusing on exploration, maybe don't get involved in operations and have sort of a different perspective on the SDGs. So we wanted to drill down into some key, point out some key contribution areas that would make sense to everyone across that. And then on top of it, we also wanted to make it usable to nonprofits and academia who might read it and go, oh wow, we never thought that mining could actually contribute to that. We did run it through a couple of those stakeholders during the Christmas period, and we did have comments like that from a couple of NGO folks who were like, oh wow, I never thought that this, I really learned a lot after they read all that. So there are challenges then, I think, in keeping everyone happy. So we really strive to have a balance. So we really focused first on core business. What is it that mining can do through their business? For poverty, for example, a huge amount of the mining revenues, taxes and royalties end up with governments who in turn reinvest that into social programs in many countries. And so then that leads to a conversation that you need to be transparent and clear and honest about sharing properly taxes and royalties. Mining can create employment directly and indirectly, and so we pulled out the aspect of employment, but also the idea of inclusive employment. That, as we know, sometimes it's easy just to employ those who are the most skilled and bring them in from the cities. If you have a mining project in a rural area, if there's no investment in local skills building, then there's sort of inherent gaps between those who have the opportunity to get employment. So we talked more about inclusive employment, the opportunity to access employment, the whole area of procurement strategies, which I think a lot of you know about, of using procurement strategies locally, regionally, nationally, in collaboration with governments, with multilaterals, to be able to leverage out the economic development, the jobs, the skills, the technology transfer. All of that can end up creating opportunities for more income for people that didn't have access to it otherwise. And then the whole resettlement and livelihood restoration piece, which is fundamentally important, particularly when you're talking about resettling communities who have traditional agricultural bases and end up perhaps being resettled into areas where they may not have access to that. And given that the risk of impoverishment is so fundamental for resettlement. So those are all things that we said, you know, this is about how the company is, these are choices the company can make within the halls of the company about how they want to operate that does have a link and an impact and contribution to poverty. And then there's ways that companies can collaborate and leverage. They can work with local governments to expand access to social services related to health and education. They can collaborate with governments and nonprofits and other stakeholders around livelihood options. They can formalize these agreements through community development agreements. And then we tried to end each chapter with some case studies. Now, just a bit on the case studies, Brandon did a huge amount of work trying to find case studies that were validated. So we tried not so much to go to, we tried to find case studies where there was a third party that had come in and actually done the work. We understand that there's a lot of other case studies out there, so it would be great to get some suggestions around that. But each chapter ends up with, you know, 2 or 3 case study examples. And then another example is around clean water and sanitation. Obviously, there's a huge amount, as we have our contaminant expert here. I've never heard anyone call themselves a contaminant expert. There are lots of ways that mining companies can contribute to access to clean water through the management of water and wastewater in their facilities, monitoring water quality, all of the issues that we know are related to engaging with communities around access to water. And then from a collaborate and leverage perspective, mining companies can collaborate with other stakeholders and actors on watershed management. This is obviously the norm. More and more across the industry. There's lots of great people and companies out there looking at shared water infrastructure, how to leverage partnership agreements that delivers benefits to the broader community and society, and also at the same time the mining company, and then also contributing through potable water and sanitation planning. So each chapter is about 2 to 3 pages long and follows that, that layout. We tried to be very specific with very specific suggestions. All of this is not stuff that we thought up, but this is stuff that's actually going on out there in the industry. The industry is doing a huge amount of work, and I think the atlas is broad enough that there are some people who may be very clear on what's going on the social performance side, but if they take a look at the atlas, they can learn a little bit about what's going on in climate change or what's going on in industry innovation. So that's a little bit about how each chapter is laid out.
And just maybe one clarification on the targets. Those of you who are not familiar with targets, some of them are very specific. So for example, our UN SDG 7 target on energy efficiency is double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. So, you know, they're very clear metrics. There are others which are a bit more amorphous, which are, you know, achieve higher levels of productivity through diversification. You know, so that's also part of the challenge with these, which I'm sure Sharon and Brandon have to grapple with. So
yes. Yeah. Okay. So Celine, did you want to?
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the consultative part, which is for us the most rewarding part, really, is to get your feedback. It is a consultation, so we try to keep the presentation to half an hour, which happily we have kept our target as well. And so the consultation question should be showing up on the screen. Those of you who are on the Google Hangout and have been muted by Google as per their process, you can send us an email of your questions, please. The chat facility is not as functional, and so if you could send us an email with your questions, the email address is csrm@uq.edu.au, and we will be checking the email right now to get your questions, and we will then air them on the consultation as well. So those of you, of course, who are on the phone, we would welcome your questions directly, one at a time, and certainly within the room, we're fortunate to have participants as well. So the key questions which we've laid out, we don't have to go through each and every one of them, but they're on the screen there. It's really important for us to, first of all, ascertain that the sector will be utilizing the SDGs framework in some way or not. Some of this came through Brandon's interviews with industry, which have been documented as well. So Brandon, you may want to, for this overarching question, provide some anchor about the feedback of how the industry told you how they're going to use this process, but then we'll open it up to the industry participants as well.
Sure, thanks, William. So as far as what I heard from industry using the SDGs, as you can probably imagine, there's a huge range. There's a lot of variation. So, I mean, some had, barely knew that the SDGs existed, but on the other end, some had been following them kind of all along during the WEFA process to the UN General Assembly in September. So there's a big range and a major difference in the perceived relevance from one end to the other. But I think the conversations in general were very fruitful, and I would say that they all opened some eyes in terms of things that industry can do to kind of move the needle, but they also opened my eyes to kind of some of the realities that companies were experiencing on the ground in very particular ways. So not just kind of general CSR, but maybe a company had a specific instance with trying to make their energy mix more renewable or something, and maybe they ran into obstacles there. So the conversation happened at a variety of levels as well.
Okay, very good. Well, let's open it up to our industry friends who are online and in the room. We have Rio Tinto well represented here with us, BHP, and also Cameco. So we also have different sectors represented, from uranium to coal to base metals. Let's first open it up on the phone to our friends from BHP and Cameco. Any feedback?
Look, it's Colin Tinkle here from Cameco.
Yes.
Obviously, I work in our Perth office. Our head office is in Saskatoon in Canada. And while I'm working with my management through these SDGs, it is interesting to see how they will now be meshed into the current strategies that we've been using. It's not clear to me yet exactly how this will all go. I've noticed the 6 to 7 SDGs that were highlighted where mining can make a difference, and I I fully agree with those targets. I think that makes a lot of common sense. But I think the interesting thing for me will be how this now works into the current strategies that we've been using, which are always being updated, and the differences across the different countries and how different approaches are made towards these SDGs. Obviously, in some countries, they're well advanced in this area. In other countries, they're way behind. So that'll be interesting. We only operate in Kazakhstan, USA, Canada, Australia, but we only have operations in some of those. So it is quite different for us as we move right through. But exactly the reason why I linked in today, I wanted to find out how other companies are treating this and how they're finding the way they're melding this into their current strategies for CSR.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Helen, thank you for going first. It's Melinda here. The way that I see this being relevant is that BHP currently does a standalone annual sustainability report that gives a really clear indication of how we're performing in the sustainability space. And we use the GRI as a framework for making sure we meet the reporting requirements under that. We also use CDP for disclosing our performance in water and climate change. And then the way that we actually require our businesses to perform, which I guess is the opportunities for implementing the SDGs, is to have a look at the most material elements for our businesses as a whole. And that's what we then put in our sustainability report. And also we track in terms of public targets. So we use a 5-year public target setting process, and we're coming up to the end of that 5-year process. So FY17 will be the end of our last public reporting on elements of climate change and human rights, access to water, and a lot of those elements that have been brought up so well in the chapters in this document. So I can see this as being very relevant for one of the context setters for looking at our FY18 plus 5-year public commitments of what's most material to our business and what would we like to set and then achieve in terms of our sustainability performance.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, thank you. And with regard to the way in which you have used other metrics, I think that's a really important point, that there are all these other metrics like GRI and so on. How does this process complement those in terms of the boardroom discussions and all? I think that's one of the things that the UN has been trying to grapple with, because they have so many of these business interface initiatives. Also, there's the UN Global Compact. There are lots of other efforts underway to bring business and the international community together. There's the human rights mechanism, which was set up in the post-Ruggie process. So, any thoughts on that as well?
So in those elements that you mentioned, yes, we're signed up to those, the voluntary principles, the Global Compact, extractive industries, transparency initiatives, and also the principles from ICMM. So I see them as complementary, and I think that the targets that have been proposed under the SDGs may just be an extra input to keeping focused on what we're actually trying to achieve. So, we try and keep very clear on what's material and then focus our efforts on that. And within that, I think it might be that we can look at some of the outcomes recommended through the SDGs and see what we can be doing to progress towards those.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Rio Tinto.
Look, I think, thanks for that, Colin. I think we'll just pretty much cover a lot of what I was actually going to say from a Rio perspective. It's, you know, I think there's obviously some good consistency between BHP and Rio's approach, particularly with respect to SD reporting. I think that there's a definite opportunity to look in our future SD reports as to how we can, both from a materiality assessment perspective, but also supporting our local sites, but also globally in terms of how we want to be targeting and focusing some of our reporting, thinking about the type of case studies we might be wanting to look at and how we want to report on progress and approach. So I think there's some really good opportunities there, and I think that certainly the document, as it is at the moment, provides some good guidance and some good suggestions in that respect. I think that it also presents a good opportunity to support and our thinking around some of our external engagement as well. I think there's some great opportunities, you know, as with BHP, Rio Tinto has a wide range of external targets and commitments. Ours have just been reset, so Karen works much closer than I do in these spaces, but the communities and social performance, as well as other targets, have recently been reset. But there's certainly, we've done a lot of work in the past to, I guess, map the Millennium Development Goals against our targets, and very much drove our target setting, particularly in the community space. And we've very much used the SDGs to assist us in guiding the development of our targets as well. So I think that that's useful. But I think particularly with our climate change and our water use targets, I think the SDGs provide a good opportunity perhaps to link in and to be able to demonstrate perhaps how we are delivering under and supporting a number of those elements, which is maybe not how we may have communicated specifically, you know, in the past with some of our external stakeholders. So I think that's probably something that, and I think it will be, you know, and again, you know, in all of our strategy setting out for both our operating sites, but also our broader sustainable development, HSEC, human rights strategy, asset development and commitments. I guess that will assist us, I think, in an ongoing fashion. I think on a year-on-year planning strategy development perspective, I think it's useful and valuable to continue to go back and say, okay, you know, how are we, you know, how are these programs delivering on, or are there opportunities for us to further refine some of those programs to deliver better on some of these areas? Is there anything else?
Great, okay, thank you. Any points also from other participants now around the applicability of these targets to your work, apart from the mining companies themselves? I think we have consulting firm also representation here, as well as from academia.
Don Mills, UBC.
Oh yes, Don, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Celine. I'm very interested in some of the companies' methodological frameworks in which they are, you know, starting to amass their data, and, you know, sort of they can somewhat speak to it, because I know sometimes, you know, surveys, questionnaires, etc., you know, get some information or get some types of information, but not necessarily information that, you know, gives an indication of plus or minus. Could they speak to some of that? Maybe Chemical could speak to that?
I really can't. That's mainly done from the head office in Saskatoon, so I'm not really involved in that. So I'd rather not, because it's not an area that I have got involved in.
Okay. Yeah, okay, Ken, maybe BHP? Thank you.
Yes, can I just make sure I understand your question? So the data that's reported publicly, you're interested in either different cuts of that data or access to different components of how we've wrapped up data to make certain statements?
Methodology. What is your methodological approach to finding out some of these, you know, your information? Is it surveys, internet surveys, interviews, what type of methodologies do you use in terms of coding information, stuff like that, or processing it?
I'll answer on the piece that I know about, which is, so for a lot of the statements that we make, so particularly go back to the sustainability report, the data in there is actually independently verified by KPMG, and so it's usually using literally monitoring data and source data from every one of our businesses. So KPMG do a reasonable level of assurance on components and limited on others. So that's for a lot of the environmental data. Does come back to specific monitoring and measuring. For some of our community performance, community reputation, we have we do standard surveys to get community opinions on pieces. Is this the type of answer that you're looking for? Is that what you're asking?
So I'm just sort of trying to, get a handle on how you, come up with your baseline. I understand, environmental monitoring and, a lot of other data that can be collected like that.
Yeah, so we will, within BHP, be gathering that and then putting it up to a level, so up to a global level to be publishing. And then sometimes through our different industry associations, so I know within Australia through the NCA, we just sometimes do a different cut of our data. So if the NCA is actually looking for data relevant just to Australia, we will talk about as an industry how we can provide that to the NCA if that's going to assist in, demonstrating some kind of performance. So there's the opportunity sometimes that we do that as well.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. So in terms of one of the points I would like to engage on is to focus on the aspects which might be missing. Part of any good consultation is to figure out what to do a gap analysis, essentially. So may I request everyone who is engaged in Google Hangout friends as well as online and in the room to just take 2 minutes and think through what might be missing. Be a bit reflexive with the document. I know everyone couldn't have read the whole thing, but browsing through it and just from the conversations thus far in the presentation, what do you think is missing, which we should include? Okay, and it's best to give you 2 minutes because otherwise thinking on your feet is never fun. So 2 minutes, quick thoughts on a gap analysis, please. Google Hangout friends, please email me your responses, csrm@uq.edu.au, because the chat room feature sadly is not functioning as we would have hoped. So please send by email your responses. csrm@uq.edu.au. Thank you. Okay, so we've had our 2 minutes reflection time. So what have we missed here?
I'm happy to start.
Yes, please.
So I think that I think it's a bit comprehensive, but I do think there's an opportunity in a number of the areas I've flagged, one or two, but to further reflect on or flag the opportunity in this through our supply chains. I think that there is a lot of leverage that we have in our supply chains in particular, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to encourage improved outcomes as well as mandating obviously appropriate behaviour. It's certainly an area that we're seeing significantly increased focus on. There's quite a lot of very significant focus through the UNGPs in that area. But more broadly, when we look at the Modern Day Slavery Act coming out of the UK, as well as a number of acts in the US, I think there's definitely some opportunities to really strengthen some of those. I think, for example, in SDG 8, there's an opportunity, for example, around protection of labour rights and ending child labour through stronger supply chain management. So I think I just think that's probably an area that we can further develop and strengthen, because I think there really is. I mean, there's only, as we flagged, there's so many direct sort of roles within the mining sector itself, but the indirect, the influence in a much broader space than that indirect.
So you're talking about the supply chain of what mining companies purchase?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, we've got the broader value chain stuff, and there's a number of different certification processes, obviously RJC and ASI and various different things that are supporting that. But I think certainly within our own supply chain, so our procurement of, and that's certainly an area of focus for Rio Tinto at the moment.
Very good, thank you.
That's probably the primary. And I guess just around inclusion and diversity, I think making sure that we're really focusing on the value of inclusion, and that it's not just focused on, I guess, marginal communities and employing. I mean, that's obviously incredibly important, but broadening it out to being, I guess, about leadership, inclusion, diversity, and being able to demonstrate that's useful. And just finally, the VPSHRs in SDG 16, I think, would be strengthened.
Okay, excellent. Other gaps, please. Any other comments online on gaps?
So then, do we not hear this online?
On the Google Hangout, we have 8 people. We're trying to get the names there, but it's somehow not giving us the names. But I know, for example, one person has emailed me from Irma, the certification, Amy Boulanger. Amy is online from Irma, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. So yes, we've got, unfortunately the technology is not giving us the name, but there are 8 people. Other gaps, please? Also, yes.
This is Judith from QUT. We were talking about accountability, and I'm wondering, because the SDGs are so broad, whether there's, and in accountability, there's a lot of inconsistency because there's so many frameworks for metrics. I'm wondering if they've built in any benchmarking or monitoring types of capabilities to make sure they're meeting goals.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe, Brandon, can you comment on the effort? Do you know what's going on with the SDG target framework that they're working on?
Yeah, so the target, so there are 169 targets, and those were decided kind of at the same time as the goals, and that was back in September. They're also indicators. I don't think that the final set of indicators has been decided. If it has, it's been very recent. And basically the idea with indicators is that they're translating all of the ambition into measurable items. So that's definitely in process. It's slated to be done soon. And then those, because they're measurable, they can be integrated into, I think, other reporting standards or process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's a really good point in terms of the actual indicators of progress that will be moved forward. There are existing indices, certainly on the environmental front, the Environmental Performance Index that Yale and the World Economic Forum use, and I think some of those may be incorporated within these metrics because they're already well developed, and so I'm sure those would come in. Okay, is Barry?
It's just something I picked up because
Yes.
of my particular involvement that I have with professional activities. With SDG 3, which is good health and well-being,
Yes.
ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. The key statistic of the WHO is that 20% of the world's population gets 80% of the healthcare, and the other 80% are reliant on traditional practices and techniques like using herbal medicine. So that is, most of the populations in developing countries use traditional practices. So that in terms of ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages, those practices are important in developing countries.
Yes, and actually the mining industry in some areas with traditional ecological knowledge has played an important role in, I know Rio has been involved in some of its indigenous programs to bring back the traditional knowledge of plants and other things, whether it's for healthcare or it's for remediation or biodiversity, amelioration issues,
That to preserve that knowledge.
To preserve that, and I think the industry can play a role in that.
In supporting
that, yeah, exactly.
Like camel caravan that they've reenacted just recently.
No, yes. Any other thoughts on gaps, please?
Hi, Chris Vernon from MSCI ESG Research in Sydney. Just along the lines of that corporate accountability question that was posed, I guess trying to understand, so we assess the sustainability strategy of corporates over the long term in terms of their financial materiality and provide that information to investors. So we'd like to understand a bit more about how companies assess the materiality aspect of feed in their strategy, and BHP is a good example of divulging quite a lot of information about their targets and their strategy. But in terms of prioritising this word materiality, is that materiality in terms of these sustainable development goals, or is it materiality in terms of the company's bottom line? So understanding exactly what is meant by materiality and how these trade-offs are made over the long term is interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's well noted. Any feedback on that, colleagues? Okay. All right. Deanna, did you have a point on any gaps or?
No, I'm making some
general comments? Yeah. Okay. Very good. Yes.
I've flipped through the document
Yes.
and spoken a bit to Sharon about it. But just to kind of put it out there, I mean, it's such an interesting document because it's such an important statement about the connection between mining and SDGs, and does get you thinking. Just kind of flicking it through, kind of flicking through, it does, prompt a lot of thoughts. I think it also, the number of goals and sub-goals compared to the MDGs does remind everyone that we're increasing in complexity, like the achievement of development goals is just getting more difficult. And I think there's a real job of work to do beyond the corporate level to apply this in situ. So kind of moving a generic think piece to taking it down to individual operations and kind of thinking, okay, well here in this place, given this jurisdiction and the governance arrangements here and the type of impacts and the type of mine, what does it mean at the ground level? And I think that's going to be a really hard graft in the current point in time in the industry, given lack of resources and stripping out of, expertise. So I think it's kind of come at a difficult time that will be difficult to push down to the operational level. So I hope that happens, but it's just a comment about degree of difficulty. I think just reading some of the text, it's achieved its goal in terms of opening mines on the SDGs. I guess what it doesn't have is and I might be wrong, it might be nuanced if you spend the time to read it, is kind of the link between human rights and harm and development and opportunities, because the UNGP is the Do No Harm framework, and the SDGs is encouraging development framework. And Ravi did stay away from helping us to make that connection and to anchor the UNGPs in, zero harm. So there's still a link that's missing there for me in terms of the human rights harm elements and the positive development opportunities. And the document is probably more on the positive side than actually pulling out some of the really crunchy stuff like, land use conflict. So there's I can't remember what I was looking through, but it's, it's more appealing words than calling out where actually really hard conflicts emerge and prevent the achievement of this goal. And that's probably not the job of this document, but it's just an observation about where it stops, which is fine. But on that theme, maybe, it might be helpful to have where dilemmas might emerge or real difficulties might emerge, or where a stretch goal might emerge. So, for example, I think in here it's ensure equal opportunities for men and women on the gender. And that's when you dig down, when you've got traditional societies and real issues around women in formal employment. I mean, ensuring equal opportunities for women is really difficult. So maybe what might be some of the dilemmas that you might need to overcome on each of these goals? And it might be the next project. It might be a bridge too far, because this is an excellent, opening of the mind about all of the different issues in here. But there is, just those barriers that are going to prevent the achievement. It's not, that doesn't, but I mean, it's a wonderful, very systematic elaboration of the goals and the connections and core business and then leveraging. So really wonderful resource, I think. So that's my impression of what will be a really useful conversation piece.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, certainly the limitations and the issue of one area which could be mentioned and more explicitly is that the mining industry is a highly cyclical industry, and so the downturn aspect, which we've all been lamenting ad nauseum, we need to perhaps bring that in. How do you get development in downturns? What are the structural aspects of that which are peculiar to the mining industry that friends at the General Assembly and the UN higher rollers should be aware of when they're making their policy statements, right? So thank you, Diana. Very good. All right. Now, just moving on to some of the other questions. As I said, we don't need to cover each and every one of them, but what would be helpful is also to get a sense for this, especially from the perspective of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, because we're trying to also come up with some examples that can be showcased. There's a question we put forward: are there examples or case studies that should be included? So this is open to any and all friends in academia. Clearly, you have students who are running around doing fascinating work. Dawn, I'm sure you have people up in BC doing great stuff. Examples you can share, QUT friends, others that we can include in this or for future reference.
Yeah, thank you, Salim. The master thesis that is almost finished, and it is looking at inclusion in terms of issues around what's sort of the horizon of our LNG at the source. So it'll be very timely for this. I'll send you the abstract, and
Okay.
And we can maybe put together an article for this.
Yeah.
It's, you know, massive piece of land, but it's looking at,
So this is the LNG one though. Do you have any examples on mining? Because unfortunately this particular exercise is very focused on mining, and there is this iron curtain between the solid and the liquid and gaseous.
okay, well, I'll think about it. This is what
Okay.
in Ontario, and we've been looking at to create manuals for communities because of the Indigenous language in Northern Ontario is Ojibwe Cree, and there's a constant discussion on, you know, what's going on in the mine, and we're looking at doing some translation of mining practices and also the mineral processing practices in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And that's you know, actually quite exciting because it sort of hits on the water quality because all the lines are upstream right now and everybody lives downstream. And so water quality is a really high one on the list. And the processing is, you know, heap leach and also lots of pools.
Okay. Yeah, that would be really good. So if you can share that, we'll keep an eye on that one. It brings in Indigenous knowledge as well as some clear metrics on environmental performance.
Yeah.
Other examples from industry, PHP, Chemical Friends, anything on your end of you know, best practices that would be worth highlighting? I know that BHP's work with ICMM has brought in a lot of interesting developments around the MPD toolkit and its usage.
Yeah, so then what's your timing on this? Is it before April the 8th? So is that, are you looking to finalise this document by then?
Yes, I think Brandon and Sharon can address the firm timeline. I believe April 8th, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Brandon?
So my suggestion would be, if you've still got Brandon and Sharon working as authors on this, to just have a look at our probably last 2 or 3 years worth of sustainability reports, because they always come with case studies. So one of the most tricky things is to release something from the company, but once it's already been publicly released, as all of the case studies in those sustainability reports have been, I don't think it would be difficult at all to have them reproduced in a document like this. So my suggestion is actually for you to come back to me, and then I'm happy to approach the business and say, yeah, can we add these ones, rather than me put them forward, because you might know more where the gaps are that you'd like to fill. So there's probably, there would be at least 20 to 40 case studies in each year's report.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll definitely refer to those. Yes, others, Chemical examples?
Yeah, so exactly the same. That's a lot easier that way. We would be exactly the same position.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the water keepers reports, and there is a lot of areas, similar sort of thing, around about 15 to 20 odd case studies in those reports for the last 2 or 3 years easily. So we'd be very keen to do the same. As you mentioned from Rio, it is hard to get the releasing of stories that haven't already been released. That can take months. So so if we're working on it by that April date, then we'd like to do the same, if that's okay.
Okay, yep, that's fine, certainly. I think Chemical's work in, your work in Kazakhstan would be especially interesting because it's a country that has not been as well studied. And yeah, so definitely that would be worth looking into. Rio Friends, we are the deep end with case studies, with all kinds of interesting work.
Yeah, and it's also that why gender matters, why human rights, heritage matters. Those would be.
We've got some really
and
great
I did say there was one in there already about like gender matters, but I think there will probably be some case studies within those documents, and, you know, there should be, you know, that new agreements manager. I've been released before April, so, I guess, you know, we would, I don't have the date for release of our new SD report, but having just written some case studies, you know, if that comes out, if our 2015 SD report comes out, I know there's a number in there. But I guess my only question on that was that you mentioned at the beginning that you consciously chose some case studies that had either third-party involvement or were written by someone else. I mean, is that something? Because I mean, obviously, some of our case studies, and I'm sure BHP and Cameco are the same, are going to be talking about partnerships. But there's going to be others, particularly around maybe some of our news, but also our environmental case studies and a whole number of other things that might be case, you know, not about partnerships per se, but actual improvements in, you know, water recycling that are not necessarily third-party verified, insofar as having a third-party partner. So is that, I mean, is that something that you're going to?
Brandon was the case study maestro. He can respond to that question.
Yeah, so as far as case studies, I mean, there are a lot of great ones to choose from. As you mentioned, we had some difficulty looking for kind of third-party, you know, partnership-oriented ones. So we definitely be keen to see some of those. Yeah, I think one of the things that we wanted to do was really illustrate partnerships, because any kind of non-industry reader of this report, if they saw kind of the same material that is in company sustainability reports, which are great, that they might kind of, I don't know, they might want to see kind of more stakeholders involved. So anything that people have along those lines would be very useful.
So if there's case studies that have been written up by third parties, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I think there is a real, you know, concern, especially because it's a UN process, and World Economic Forum has come under considerable criticism for being too pro-industry. So there needs to be something presented with a little bit of nuance and more critical multi-stakeholder perspective. So that would be great, especially if there are cases that civil society has championed as well. That could be highlighted. That would be the best outcome.
So, can I ask a question?
Please.
So, it would be great to, obviously, within part of this, get any feedback from anyone on how this might be improved. But obviously, the scope of this atlas is somewhat set, and these are going to be, you know, not necessarily improvements that are going to change the entire document. So then I would ask, so what do you think should come next, if anything? What would be useful? What would you want to see? I mean, Deanna's talked about, so people have talked about metrics and how people are measuring, what are the frameworks, how is materiality defined, examples of, you know, really hard challenges when you try to execute this on the ground. There's a whole range of things there. So what would you want to see next from your perspective? And then, is the World Economic Forum, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, and UNDP the organizations that should be doing that thing that comes next? So I think that the organizations can think about, well, we might be able to take some of those suggestions forward, but they can also think about, well, we could actually help to get others who might be more properly placed to take those bits forward. So I would ask that sort of broadly about what you think might come next, as sort of another level of focus and detail to this broad overview.
Indeed. Feedback on that, next steps in terms of resources under the same umbrella of partners?
Well, it's what the same umbrella of partners can do, and then, you know, maybe the same umbrella of partners might not be well placed to do that thing, but they could leverage others to do that thing.
And keeping in mind that goal 17 is itself partnerships for goals. So that in itself is a goal. So we have to, you know, that might be a nice way to couch it. What could be future?
I mean, I could think that, you know, there could be a resource where companies where people have blacked out the names actually rock up with, wow, this was a really difficult thing that we did. And this is how we sort of did it, right?
Yeah.
But how do you do that in a way that, what companies are going to be willing to share that? But sometimes those hardest examples are the ones that create the biggest learning, right? Or, if it's around methodologies, maybe it's sharing about, different ways that people are looking at materiality, right? So I'm just, sort of a brainstorm around those bits. And you can answer that now, or you can communicate with us after if a brilliant idea comes to you.
Because the SDGs are so new, and because a lot of change is going to happen at a national level or a sub-national level, I don't know how, these high-level forums work, but for somehow to be able to generate conversations like this one at a national and sub-national level, in particular jurisdictions where companies operating close by or on, in corridors or sharing the same kind of infrastructure can connect on, collaborative shared value or whatever in a tangible, in situ place where there's a number of companies operating, strikes me as a good thing to do. And there are organisations that are really well placed to do that. So say the East Africa Centre for Responsible Business, which has got donor money from whoever, they're actively holding dialogues, with an emerging extractive industry around human rights and other things. And this seems like a natural, work in the SDGs and how they're relevant to, a growing extractive industry there. So I could see how where you could take it. I just don't know how you would do that, but
with the goal being bring it down, ground it, bring it down.
Yeah.
Not the big picture, but actually bring it down and try to.
Yeah. And when people have got shared problems in a particular jurisdiction, whether it's around regulation or oversight or corruption or violence or whatever, that's often some of the barriers that collectively need to be overcome. So it's a less threatening thing than a particular company with its dilemma.
Right.
It's a shared dilemma where a conversation could occur, which would be really good.
Indeed.
I think Jan's comment with respect to the UNGPs and the SDGs and looking at, I guess, the interfaces or otherwise is useful as well. Because I would agree. I think that there's the UNGPs and the expectations from a variety of different actors in that space around, particularly around corporates, and I guess increasingly as well around, so there is more of a focus on states through NAPs, but I would say that we have definitely seen a predominant focus on corporates, and push, and strong drives down, various different reporting frameworks and others, and in the SDGs. And I guess just ensuring that there's, that where there are linkages, that they are recognised and seen and being made aware of. Because I think it would be a shame if we went down completely different paths. And there was expectations for us to deliver on a whole lot of different, we certainly internally work very hard to try and look at all of the cross, the cross areas, and I certainly have been doing quite a bit of work in that space. But I think that would be very valuable at that UN.
Like
do you think the different requirements, mandatory requirements for reporting throughout the different countries, which are becoming more stricter and more regular, how will that affect the way that we report on SDGs?
No, absolutely. I think there is a lot of pressure for countries to have interoperability, basically, between reporting requirements. The same is true of certification systems, which is an area that we're doing a project right now on for the German Development Agency, is that there are so many certification systems now, and we have one of our participants on the Google Hangout is from the Initiative for Responsible Mining, and Irma, and she has been in touch with also a lot of the stakeholders in this regard, and one of the goals there was to try and have something more streamlined. So that it's becoming inefficient for companies to comply with all of this. And even if it isn't compliance, if you're trying to make sure all these different camps are happy, there needs to be some willingness to engage. So it's on the horizon of the governments, the development donors, and certainly the industry associations.
Yeah.
And I think that's where actually this, around the goal 17, one of the things which should be noted is to make that the partnerships should allow for procedural efficiency to really play out.
What's that mean, procedural efficiency?
So that, you are able to have one sort of clearinghouse of all the data and be able to get that accessible so that you're not reporting multiple times to different places. Some people have even suggested at the international level for environmental data, there should be, companies can actually report all into one system. Certainly for carbon emissions, that's being done, but carbon emissions, because it's monitored at that, but not for water quality or other things like that. So.
On that, I think that maybe is, well, I'm thinking on my feet, so this may not come out well. But I know that we're doing some work on the, some of you may or may not be aware of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Project that the Institute of Human Rights and Business, as well as Aviva and other stakeholders are driving at the moment, which will come out this year. And what they have as part of their methodology, they're indicators, but they've actually flagged where it may link to or be similar to GRI. So there may be some opportunities in that, looking at that efficiency space, be it GRI or others, but, as a lot of us do report on, use GRI as guidance for our sustainability reporting, that where there are opportunities to flag, which that just might be that may be useful.
Map the GRI indicators against the SDGs, or at least provide an indication of synergy.
Yeah. Brandon, do you know if they're going to do that as part of the indicators work that the UN's doing?
I'm not sure if there's going to be a direct synthesis with GRI. Off the top of my head, I can't remember where it is, but there's somewhere that does link them together, and I have an Excel spreadsheet with all that laid out.
Yeah.
Oh, your Excel spreadsheet would be very useful. People are saying.
But one of the things that comes out is, there are these initiatives which have been led by governments and there are initiatives which have been led by business. And oftentimes they are not always aligned because some of the government initiatives are very, focused on compliance. And a lot of the industry initiatives, many times, the ones that have public reporting, like GRI, they are much more focused on reputational risk and those kinds of aspects, So there is this challenge also sometimes in the, I think you need organizations like IUCN, for example, is a good one that way, which has governments as members and it has industry and civil society as members. So there's like a para-governmental organization which can be a much more effective clearinghouse for some of these kinds of initiatives. So I think on the environmental side, I personally think IUCN could play a very constructive role because it has all of them. There's a much bigger tent, really. Where like GRI has been, a lot of it was originally driven by just industry approach and so on. Okay, excellent. We've aimed to keep it at 90 minutes, the total time, but so are there any other last minute thoughts which you'd like to cover? I'll hand it over to Sharon to close. And Sharon and Brandon as well, certainly. Okay, so Sharon and Brandon.
Yeah, no, well, thanks, we appreciate it, and thanks for everybody on the Google Hangout. I guess at some point we'll find out who was on the Google Hangout.
Yes. we will, and it's been recorded as well, so the virtue of the Google Hangout is that everything has been recorded.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. So, no, thanks. We really appreciate your time, and please feel free to follow up with Salim or myself or Brandon. I think we can make our emails available to you, and then obviously a lot of you have direct relationships with Jillian Davidson at WEF. So I don't know if people know her. Jillian Davidson is the head of mining and metals at WEF. She was with Tech for for a long time, and she is a doctorate in environmental science, and she's also a social performance person. Lisa Sachs who's been leading the initiative at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment. I'm saying these names as you all might very well know them. And UNDP is Casper Soneson, who's based in New York, who's been leading this. So we're happy if you want introductions to those three folks who have collaborated to bring on Brandon and I to help write this, please do so. And we will certainly share back with them all of the information that you all have shared with us today. So we appreciate that. Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, I echo everything that Sharon and Celine said. Thank you all for your fantastic input and setting aside some time to dedicate to this. I think it's really a testament to the trajectory of the mining industry that we're all so enthusiastic about this and trying to really act on the ground and make a difference.
Great, yes. Thank you so much to all of you. Thanks, Brendan, especially. It's past the midnight hour in New York, so thank you. And our friends in academia, thank you for participating. QUT friend, I hope we get to meet at some point in person.
Likewise, I think I have a case study that we
Okay.
can talk about, and I'll send you some information.
Yes, yeah, please do stop by sometime too. We're just down up the river. So, yes, thank you so much. Okay, I will be in touch then. Cheers.
Thank you.
Goodbye, thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you. We should have more active involvement.
I did ask them.
I haven't had the back conversation, so I just thought I won't say anything, just.
Okay. But there is an online forum, so definitely do that. So everything going. Did we get recorded then, Michelle?
Yes. Oh, good.
And there is a way to know who was online.
Oh my God.